In the early 1980s, the United States trembled, not from war or natural disaster, but from a fear far more nebulous, a fear that crept into homes, churches, schools, and courtrooms. It was a fear not of something that could be seen or proven, but of a whisper in the dark, a shadow on the wall, satanic cults, child sacrifice, and ritual abuse. For over a decade, America found itself in the iron grip of a moral panic so fierce and irrational that it destroyed lives, tore families apart, and left scars that still ache today. This era, now known as the Satanic Panic, was not simply a period of paranoia, it was a cultural fever that blurred the line between myth and truth, delusion and justice. For young people today, the idea of mass belief in underground satanic cabals might seem bizarre, almost laughable. But for those who lived through it, the panic was all-consuming. Teachers, daycare workers, pastors, and even family members were accused of the unthinkable, satanic rituals, sexual abuse, and murder. Often with no physical evidence, lives were destroyed based on suggestion, fear, and fabricated memories. The courtrooms were packed with weeping parents, accusatory children, and devastated defendants. But the Satanic Panic wasn't just about crime, it was about control. It was about a society grappling with change, rising divorce rates, women entering the workforce, youth rejecting tradition, and a nation looking for someone, or something, to blame. Satan, the ultimate scapegoat, fit the bill. And so began one of the darkest chapters in recent American history. To understand how the Satanic Panic emerged, we must peer into the moral climate of the 1970s and early 1980s, a time of cultural flux and spiritual uncertainty. The post-Vietnam and Watergate era left Americans disillusioned with government and skeptical of authority. At the same time, evangelical Christianity surged in influence, calling the nation back to traditional values. Within this fertile ground of anxiety and conservatism, seeds of fear began to sprout. Enter Michelle Remembers, a 1980 book by psychiatrist Lawrence Posner and his patient-turned-wife Michelle Smith. The book detailed Michelle's recovered memories of being abused by a satanic cult as a child. She described ceremonies involving blood, bones, demons, and even Satan himself. The book, though now thoroughly debunked, was presented as fact. It became a sensation, stoking the fires of fear and serving as a blueprint for similar tales of satanic ritual abuse. Around the same time, the rise of daycare centers triggered anxieties about who was caring for children now that more mothers were entering the workforce. With parents no longer the sole caretakers, paranoia bloomed. What if something dark was happening behind the colorful walls of those facilities? The Reagan era, marked by the rise of the religious right, painted America's moral decay in apocalyptic tones. Rock music, horror films, Dungeons and Dragons, and even Halloween were seen as Trojan horses for demonic influence. Preachers warned of Satan's reach, and talk shows began inviting survivors of cults to share their stories. It didn't matter that these tales were unverifiable, that no physical evidence existed, or that stories changed with time. The panic had already taken root. And once planted, fear spreads fast, especially when it's fertilized by outrage and watered by media. It is easy to forget how powerful the media can be until you see it in motion, breathless headlines, ominous music, camera angles framing every accused as a monster. During the Satanic Panic, television wasn't just reporting the news, it was creating the crisis. Daytime talk shows such as Geraldo, Oprah, and Sally Jessy Raphael hosted so-called survivors of satanic ritual abuse, who told terrifying tales of being abducted, tortured, and brainwashed. Audiences gasped and wept. Geraldo Rivera's 1988 special, Exposing Satan's Underground, drew over 20 million viewers. In the program, Rivera stated with confidence that satanic cults were not only real but operating in every major city, right under our noses. He offered no evidence, only stories and emotional testimonies, but that was enough. Viewers believed. In print, magazines and newspapers fanned the flames. Local papers ran lurid front-page articles filled with speculation and insinuation. Sensationalism sold, and fear was a bestseller. Moral crusaders joined in, from pastors to parent groups, calling for bans on music, games, and books that supposedly promoted satanic ideology. Rock bands like Judas Priest, Ozzy Osbourne, and Slayer were accused of brainwashing youth. Even the Smurfs were called out by some as demonic symbols in disguise. Everywhere, it seemed, darkness lurked. And the press, instead of challenging the narrative, became part of it. The effect on the public was chilling. Communities turned on their own. Neighbors eyed each other suspiciously. Parents clutched their children tighter. The message was clear: evil is here, and it's after your kids. The media, instead of being a check on panic, became a megaphone for hysteria. What makes the Satanic Panic especially tragic is not just how many were falsely accused, but how few people stood up for them. Once accused, people were presumed guilty, even in the absence of any physical evidence. Trials dragged on for years, families were bankrupted, reputations ruined, and innocent people were jailed. Among the most infamous cases was the McMartin preschool trial. In 1983, a mother accused staff at a Manhattan Beach, California preschool of abusing her son. Soon, other children were questioned, often with suggestive, leading questions by therapists and investigators. The children's answers became more outrageous with time, describing underground tunnels, ritual ceremonies, flying witches, and even encounters with lions and astronauts. None of this was ever proven. Yet, charges were filed against 7 teachers. The trial became the longest and most expensive in American history. After years of emotional testimony, the defendants were acquitted or had charges dropped. But by then, their lives were destroyed. Ray Buckey, one of the teachers, spent over 5 years in jail without a single conviction. In Texas, Fran and Dan Keller, daycare operators, were accused in 1991 of bizarre abuse involving satanic rituals, including flying children to Mexico and back in a single day. No flights, witnesses, or evidence existed. Yet, the Kellers were convicted and spent 21 years in prison before being released and exonerated. And they were not alone. Across the country, dozens were imprisoned. Many of them were women and people working with children. Accusations were enough. The fear had become so deeply embedded in the culture that evidence was almost irrelevant. The true victims were not just those jailed, but their children, their spouses, their communities. Families were torn apart. Lives were lost to depression, shame, suicide. And all because society chose fear over facts. The Satanic Panic didn't stay confined to TV screens and living rooms. It marched straight into courtrooms, and it did so hand in hand with a justice system that had forgotten its own guiding principles: innocence until proven guilty, the need for evidence, the dangers of mass hysteria. When fear dominates reason, even the law can bend and break. During the 1980s and early 1990s, over 100 daycare workers across the United States were accused of ritualistic sexual abuse. The charges often read like horror movie scripts: children allegedly transported through secret tunnels, participating in animal sacrifice, or being threatened with death if they told anyone. These accusations almost always lacked physical evidence. Many claims were impossibly fantastical. Yet the accusations stuck. One of the primary drivers behind these prosecutions was the way children were interviewed. Interviewers, often with good intentions but poor training, used leading questions, praised certain answers, and repeated sessions until the child gave the right story. What emerged were tales shaped by suggestion, not memory. In psychological terms, these were not lies, but confabulations, unintentional falsehoods born of pressure, fear, and manipulation. The judicial system, which should have demanded evidence and questioned plausibility, instead echoed the panic. Prosecutors wielded expert witnesses who testified about satanic ritual abuse as though it were a recognized, proven phenomenon. Judges allowed questionable testimony. Juries, terrified and emotional, convicted people whose only crime was caring for children during a paranoid era. The children in these cases were also victims. They were made to believe they had experienced horrors they hadn't. They were separated from caretakers they loved. They grew up under clouds of trauma not from abuse, but from being pulled into a national delusion. We like to believe the justice system is blind, impartial. But the Satanic Panic revealed just how easily it can be manipulated by collective fear. And how devastating the results can be. To understand how the Satanic Panic reached such fevered heights, one must examine the strange blend of religion, pseudoscience, and therapy that powered its engine. It wasn't just about evil, it was about believing that evil could hide in plain sight and that only a chosen few could uncover it. Evangelical Christianity played a significant role in framing the narrative. Preachers warned their congregations that Satan was working through television, music, and schools. Books like Turmoil in the Toybox and Prepare for War described how seemingly innocent items, Barbie dolls, unicorns, yoga, even teddy bears, were tools of the devil. Halloween was seen as an open invitation for satanic activity. The world, they said, had become a spiritual battlefield, and children were on the front lines. But religion alone didn't explain the panic. Psychology joined in, particularly a therapeutic movement that embraced the idea of repressed and recovered memories. Some therapists began to believe that patients who experienced trauma, especially abuse, could forget it entirely, only to remember it later during therapy. While trauma can affect memory, the extreme version of memory recovery became a dangerous tool. Patients were often hypnotized or led through suggestive questioning. A therapist might say, "Are you sure your father didn't touch you?" Or, "Many women who have nightmares like yours have been part of satanic abuse." Desperate to make sense of pain or mental illness, some patients came to believe they had suffered things they never had. They described torture chambers, covens, baby sacrifices, things beyond belief, but accepted as truth. These so-called recovered memories destroyed families. Parents were accused. Siblings estranged. Innocent people went to prison. And all of it was supported by pop psychology that had more drama than science. The 1990s brought increasing skepticism to these practices. Studies showed how easy it was to implant false memories. The American Psychological Association warned against unverified recovered memories. But by then, the damage was done. When religion stokes fear, and therapy confirms it with pseudoscience, the result is a potent, and poisonous, cocktail. One that left lasting scars. Long after the headlines faded and the courtrooms emptied, the true cost of the Satanic Panic remained, etched into the hearts and minds of those who lived through it. The accused, the children, and their families all bore the burden of a society that had lost its grip on truth. Imagine spending years in prison, labeled a monster, your name smeared across newspapers, only to be told you were never guilty to begin with. Many of the falsely accused found that exoneration didn't mean freedom. When Dan and Fran Keller were released after 21 years in prison, they had no home, no money, no jobs. They had to learn how to use the internet. They had to rebuild their lives in a world that had moved on without them. And still, some people in their town whispered that they must have done something wrong. Others weren't so lucky. Some died behind bars. Some committed suicide. Some never reconciled with their children or communities. The accusations, though proven false, stuck like tar. But it wasn't just the accused who suffered. Children who had been interviewed again and again, who were told they had been abused, often internalized those stories. They grew up confused, ashamed, broken. Some remember being told their dolls had been possessed. Others remember being shown pictures or asked if their parents hurt them. Many of them look back now and wonder what was real and what wasn't. Entire families were shattered. Trust was burned to the ground. And perhaps worst of all, the panic stole focus from real abuse cases. While attention and resources were poured into chasing imaginary Satanists, many genuine victims of sexual and domestic abuse were ignored or disbelieved. Pain like this doesn't just vanish. It echoes. It hides in silence, shame, and therapy rooms. The Satanic Panic may have ended as a news story, but for those who lived it, the chapter is still unfinished. While the legal and psychological impacts of the Satanic Panic were devastating, pop culture also played a role in both feeding the fire and preserving its memory. Music, games, movies, and books of the 1980s and 1990s became battlegrounds in the supposed war for America's soul. One of the biggest targets of this cultural crusade was Dungeons & Dragons, D&D, a fantasy tabletop role-playing game. Critics claimed that D&D encouraged devil worship, suicide, and even murder. Parents burned the game books. Some schools banned them. But in truth, D&D offered players a space to explore creativity, friendship, and storytelling. The panic surrounding it revealed more about adult fears than about the game itself. Heavy metal music was another scapegoat. Artists like Ozzy Osbourne, Slayer, and Marilyn Manson were accused of corrupting youth with dark imagery and lyrics. Parents and pastors called for censorship. Congressional hearings debated whether music could brainwash listeners. In some cases, musicians were even sued over teen suicides, as though their art alone could trigger tragedy. The First Amendment was put on trial, and fear often drowned out reason. Movies like The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby, though fictional, were often cited as proof of satanic influence in Hollywood. Horror as a genre was accused of glorifying evil. The irony is that many of these stories were cautionary tales, warning against unchecked power or spiritual danger. But nuance had no place in panic. Even children's media wasn't safe. Shows like He-Man, Care Bears, and Pokémon were accused of containing occult symbols. A generation grew up believing that the toys and games they loved might secretly be tools of the devil. But there's another side to this coin: resistance. Some artists leaned into the controversy, using their platforms to challenge censorship and defend freedom of expression. Bands wrote songs about the panic. Satirical films and books emerged, poking holes in the paranoia. Pop culture didn't just reflect the panic, it helped fight back against it. It reminded people to question authority, to think critically, and to refuse to let fear dictate truth. The Satanic Panic was not just a cultural scare, it led to changes in how society thought about crime, justice, and childhood safety. Laws were rewritten. Court procedures were revised. And a nation began reckoning with the consequences of having believed in monsters that weren't real. One of the most significant areas of reform was the justice system's handling of child testimony. During the height of the panic, prosecutors often relied heavily on the words of very young children, some as young as 3 or 4. These children were frequently questioned in leading, manipulative ways that contaminated their recollections. Eventually, child psychologists and legal experts realized that these techniques did more harm than good. As a result, training and guidelines for interviewing children were overhauled. Today, forensic interviews must be recorded, neutral in tone, and free from suggestive questioning. Another major shift came with the growing awareness of false memory syndrome. As wrongful convictions were overturned, courts and therapists began taking a much more cautious approach to recovered memories. The notion that a person could suddenly remember decades of hidden trauma, especially under hypnosis or suggestion, was called into question. Organizations like the False Memory Syndrome Foundation worked to educate the public about the dangers of suggestive therapy, though not without controversy. Some genuine survivors of abuse felt their experiences were being discredited by a blanket skepticism. In the wake of the panic, innocence projects sprang up across the country, focused on exonerating those wrongly convicted, many of whom were victims of the Satanic Panic. DNA testing, which was in its infancy during the 1980s, became a powerful tool for revealing the truth. Cases that had once rested solely on shaky testimony were re-examined. Freedom, though delayed, came for some. Politically, the panic helped solidify a more conservative social agenda. Laws were passed increasing penalties for child abuse, good in intent, but sometimes applied with a heavy and unjust hand. The line between protecting children and persecuting the innocent blurred. Some politicians exploited the fear to boost their campaigns, using tough on crime rhetoric and promises to root out satanic influence. And then there's the impact that can't be measured in legislation or overturned convictions, the trust that was lost, the reputations that never recovered, the friendships and families that dissolved. Even when truth prevailed, scars remained. The Satanic Panic proved that when fear guides policy, injustice isn't just likely, it's inevitable. It would be comforting to believe the Satanic Panic ended in the 1990s, that society learned its lesson, turned the page, and left the madness behind. But fear, like fire, doesn't die easily. It changes form, hides in embers, and waits for oxygen. And in our modern world, supercharged by social media, conspiracy culture, and political extremism, the embers are glowing once more. In recent years, the rise of QAnon and similar conspiracy movements has rekindled fears strikingly similar to those of the Satanic Panic. Anonymous online users claim that a secret cabal of powerful elites is abusing children in dark rituals. The accusations echo 1980s hysteria nearly word for word, claims of hidden tunnels, ritual sacrifice, and global cover-ups. As before, the allegations are presented without proof. As before, they spread like wildfire. Pizzagate, a 2016 conspiracy theory claiming that Hillary Clinton and other politicians were running a child sex ring out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., resulted in a man showing up with a gun, convinced he was about to rescue children from satanic abuse. There were no children. There was no ring. Just another lie born of internet forums and amplified by fear. What makes this modern version even more dangerous is the speed and scale of its spread. Social media allows misinformation to travel instantly, unchecked. Anyone can be accused. Anyone can become the next target of digital pitchforks. And while some laugh off these ideas as fringe nonsense, others believe, and act. Even popular entertainment hasn't escaped the resurgence. Shows like Stranger Things explore Dungeons and Dragons, secret labs, and demonic dimensions, intentionally calling back to the Satanic Panic. Meanwhile, influencers warn against yoga, crystals, and Harry Potter, claiming they open the door to demonic possession. Once again, we are living in a world where fear can masquerade as truth. Where accusations go viral faster than facts. Where satanic is still a buzzword for everything someone doesn't understand. The Satanic Panic never really ended. It just put on a new mask. You are growing up in an age of constant information. Tweets. Posts. Headlines. Videos. Everyone has a platform, and everyone has a theory. It's overwhelming. And in the noise, it's tempting to believe the loudest voices, especially when they tap into fear, anger, or the need to feel chosen to see the truth. But the Satanic Panic stands as a solemn monument to what happens when society confuses feeling with fact, when fear overpowers reason, and when rumor is given more weight than reality. For young adults today, it offers a critical lesson: truth needs defenders. You are that generation. You are the ones who will sit on juries, vote in elections, run classrooms, work in media, and become therapists, artists, pastors, parents. You are the ones who will shape the next panic, or stop it before it begins. So how do we do better? Start by asking hard questions. If someone makes a shocking claim, ask for evidence. Check sources. Understand how memory works. Learn about psychology, logic, and the human tendency to look for scapegoats in times of stress. Study history, not just its victories, but its failures. Remember that no one is immune to being manipulated. Not parents. Not teachers. Not you. The Satanic Panic was not driven by bad people, it was driven by frightened people. Good intentions do not cancel out bad outcomes. And even those who mean well can do terrible harm when they abandon truth. Also, recognize how quickly a label like satanic, evil, or enemy can dehumanize someone. Once society sees a person as a monster, it becomes easy to justify cruelty, imprisonment, or erasure. But people are more complex than caricatures. And accusations, once made, are hard to erase. Above all, hold compassion tightly. When the crowd screams for blood, when the headlines shout doom, when fear claws at your chest, take a breath. Pause. Look deeper. The truth is almost always quieter than the lie. You have inherited a world still haunted by the satanic panic. But you also have the tools to write a different story. Use them. The satanic panic of the 1980s was not just a moment in time, it was a mirror. It showed us how deeply fear can warp judgment, how quickly truth can be sacrificed on the altar of outrage, and how easily innocence can be destroyed when society is gripped by paranoia. It showed us how fragile justice can be. How susceptible we are to moral crusades. How even the best intentions, protecting children, stopping abuse, can become weapons when guided by hysteria instead of facts. It showed us that memory is malleable. That institutions can fail. That trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. But it also taught us something more enduring. It taught us that truth matters. That justice requires patience. That listening is a skill. That science and faith must walk carefully together. That asking, "How do you know?" is not an act of rebellion, it's an act of responsibility. For the falsely accused, the satanic panic was a nightmare from which they never fully woke. For the children involved, it was a confusing swirl of betrayal and fear. For the media, it was a cautionary tale of power misused. And for the nation, it was a lesson written in pain. Yet the panic also revealed a truth about humanity: we crave meaning. We want to protect each other. We fear the unknown. These instincts are not wrong, they are simply dangerous when left unchecked. You, reading this today, are part of the legacy of that era. You have the power to question, to empathize, to slow the spread of the next hysteria. You carry the light that can cut through the next wave of darkness. So remember the faces of the falsely accused. Remember the children whose voices were shaped by suggestion. Remember the lessons, the mistakes, the scars. And let the satanic panic become what it always should have been, not a blueprint for fear, but a warning. From shadows, we rise. Into truth, we walk. Let us never go back.